Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. I'm your host Mike. On this week's episode, we bring you a $100 Edric Spymaster of Trest BudgetEDH deck tech. Edric is a green and a blue for a legendary creature. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may draw a card. So with Edric, we're going to be able to draw cards whenever our creatures deal damage to one of our opponents. So we want to have a lot of little evasive threats in our deck. We're going to lean heavily on 1 and 2 mana creatures that have some sort of evasion on them to get in damage so that we can draw cards off of those Edric triggers. Because Edric is our main source of drawing cards, we want to make sure that we get Edric down early so that way we're able to draw a ton of cards whenever our creatures deal damage to our opponents. There's a ton of interaction in this deck. A lot of counterspells and ways of removing permanents off of our opponent's boards that are problematic to us in this deck. The way that we're going to win with this deck is by swinging in with a bunch of creatures that only deal 1 damage each time they hit your opponents. It's going to take us a little bit of time, so we do want a way of speeding that up, and the best way of doing that is with extra turn spells. So there are a bunch of extra turn spells in this deck, and not only that, there are a bunch of spells in our deck that help us get those extra turn spells back into our hands so that we can keep recasting them and keep beating in with our creatures until we are able to win the game through combat damage. And at the end of the video, we'll go over a couple of non-budget upgrades that we would include in this deck to make it a little bit more powerful. So first up, let's go over some of the mana ramp that we have in this deck. Now we are going to lean heavily on creatures in this deck, so our mana ramp is going to come from creatures. So first up, we have Llanowar Elves, Fyndhorn Elves, and Elvish Mystic. They all cost 1 green and tap to add a green to our mana pool. These are really great because they're cheap creatures that we can get down early so that we can play our Edric out a turn early, and then these are also going to swing in and draw us cards too, which is really great. Next up, we have Boreal Druid. It's 1 green for a snow creature. You can tap it to add a colorless to your mana pool. And then Arbor Elf is 1 green for a creature that you can tap it to untap target forest. All 5 of these creatures are great to get down on turn 1 so that we can play our Edric a turn early. The great part about it is that they can attack, help you draw cards with Edric on the battlefield as well. And then we have Priest of Titania. It's 1 and a green for a creature. Tap it to add a green to your mana pool for each elf on the battlefield. Since all the creatures I just named are elves, this is one of the best cards that you can include in your deck for mana ramp. And then we did include a couple of mana rocks in our deck. The first one being Soul Ring. It's 1 colorless for an artifact. Tap to add 2 colorless to your mana pool. Simic Signet is 2 colorless, and you can pay 1 and tap it to add a green and a blue to your mana pool. And then Talisman of Curiosity is 2 colorless for an artifact that you can tap for 1 colorless mana, or tap it and add a green and a blue to your mana pool, and it deals 1 damage to you. We do want some other ways to ramp in this deck so we can ramp into our extra turn spells that are really important to the strategy of this deck. Next up, let's go through all the interaction that we have in this deck, and we're going to start with all the counter spells that we included. So first up, we have Dispel. It's 1 blue for an instant, and you can counter target instant spell. Counterspell is blue for an instant to counter target spell, and then Negate is 1 and a blue for an instant to counter target non-creature spell. Next up, we have Swan Song. It's 1 blue for an instant, counter target enchantment, instant, or sorcery spell. Its controller creates a 2/2 blue bird creature token with flying. And then Unified Will is 1 and a blue for an instant, counter target spell if you control more creatures than that spell's controller. And then Mana Leak is 1 and a blue for an instant, counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. These are all really cheap, efficient ways of countering our opponent's spells, and these are great ones to hold up if you're about to play an extra turn spell so you can go off with Edric. You can counter your opponent's spells if you keep up the mana for it. Next up, we have Arcane Denial. It's 1 and a blue for an instant, counter target spell. Its controller may draw up to 2 cards at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, and you draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. This does come with a bit of a downside as you're going to give your opponent 2 cards. At least you get to draw 1, but it is a real cheap, efficient way of dealing with threats. And then Unwind is 2 and a blue for an instant, counter target non-creature spell, and untap up to 3 lands. I love putting these cards in my deck because it's almost a free counter spell that you can put in there since you're going to untap those lands anyway. Next up, we have a couple of ways of dealing with permanents and creatures that our opponents may play. And if your opponent plays a problematic creature that can block some of your evasive threats, you do want to get rid of it quickly. So first up, we have Rapid Hybridization. It's a blue for an instant and destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. That creature's controller puts a 3/3 green frog lizard creature token onto the battlefield. Reality Shift is 1 and a blue for an instant. Exile target creature. Its controller manifests the top card of their library. And then to manifest is to take the top card of your library, put it onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature, and if it's a creature card, you can turn it face up anytime for its mana cost. Beast Within is 2 and a green for an instant, destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature tokens. These are all really great ways of dealing with permanents and creatures your opponents control. Next up, we have a couple of ways of dealing with artifacts and enchantments. So first up, we have Caustic Caterpillar. It's a green for a creature. You can pay 1 and a green, sacrifice Caustic Caterpillar to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Great thing about this card is it's also a creature, so you can get in for some damage with Edric and then draw some cards off of it. And it also can be sacrificed at any time to destroy an artifact or enchantment too. Next up, we have Nature's Claim. It's 1 green for an instant. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. Its controller gains 4 life. And the natural state is very similar. It's a green mana for an instant. Destroy target artifact or enchantment with converted mana cost 3 or less. These are great, efficient ways of dealing with artifacts and enchantments. Next up, let's go over all the cheap evasive threats that we have in this deck. Now we do want to rely heavily on 1 mana or 2 mana threats that have some sort of evasion on them so that they can get through opposing creatures so that they can draw cards with Edric on the battlefield. So first up we have Triton Shorestalker, Mistcloaked Herald, and Slitherblade. They all cost a blue mana for creatures that can't be blocked. Next up, we have Siren Stormtamer. It's 1 blue for a creature with flying, and then you can pay a blue and sacrifice it, counter target spell or ability that targets you or a creature you control. This is a really great card to include in our deck to give some protection to our Edric. If they try to remove it, we can sack our Siren Stormtamer and counter that spell. Jace's Phantasm is 1 blue for a creature with flying, and it gets +4/+4 as long as an opponent has 10 or more cards in his or her graveyard. If you're going up against a graveyard synergistic deck, this is going to become a 5/5 real quick and start getting in for some real damage. Then we have Spectral Sailor. It's 1 blue for a creature with flash, and it has flying. You can pay 3 and a blue to draw a card. This is a very relevant threat as you can draw cards off of it, and it also has evasion so you can get in for that damage to get your draws off of Edric. Next up, we have Artificer's Assistant. It's 1 blue for a creature with flying. Whenever you cast a historic spell, scry 1. So you can put this down on turn 1, and then when you play your Edric, you'll be able to scry 1 off of this, which is really great. Then we have Zephyr Sprite. It's 1 blue for a creature with flying, and then Wingcrafter is 1 blue for a creature with Soul Bond. You may pair this creature with another unpaired creature when either enters the battlefield. They remain paired for as long as you control both of them. As long as Wingcrafter is paired with another creature, both creatures have flying. This is a great card to pair with your Edric to give your Edric some evasion as well. Next up, we have Terramander. It's 1 blue for a creature with flying, and you can pay 7 and a blue and adapt 4. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. If this creature has no +1/+1 counters on it, put 4 +1/+1 counters on it. So this can get big really quickly, especially since we'll have a bunch of instant and sorcery cards in our graveyard because of all the interaction we have in this deck. Next up, we have Hypnotic Siren. It's 1 blue for enchantment creature Siren that has Bestow. So you can pay 5 blue, and you can cast this card as an aura spell. It becomes a creature again if it's not attached to a creature. And Hypnotic Siren has flying. You control enchanted creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying. And then we have Good Ol' Lurker. It's 1 blue for a creature. Good Ol' Lurker can't be blocked, and you can Megamorph for a blue. You may cast this card face down as a 2/2 creature for 3 colorless. Turn it face up anytime for its Megamorph cost and put a +1/+1 counter on it. Next up, we have Fairy Seer. It's 1 blue for a creature with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you can scry 2. And then Flying Men and Cloud Seer are both 1 mana flying creatures. Fairy Miscreant and Scrib Sprites are both 1 mana for creatures with flying, and then Cloud of Fairies is 1 and a blue for a creature with flying. When it enters the battlefield, untap up to 2 lands. You can actually cycle this for 2 if you'd like as well to discard it to draw a card. Next up, we have Treetop Scout and Spire Tracer. Both of these can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach, and then Hope of Ghirapur is 1 colorless for a legendary artifact creature with flying, and you can sacrifice it. Until your next turn, target player who is dealt damage by Hope of Ghirapur this turn can't cast non-creature spells. This is a very relevant ability that can silence an opponent from casting spells if they're about to go off for their combo. You can do this, and then hopefully you can get an extra turn spell and go off from there. Next up, we have arguably one of the best cards in this deck, and it's Tetsuku Umezawa Fugitive. It's 1 and a blue for a legendary creature. Creatures you control with power 1 or toughness 1 or less can't be blocked. All of our creatures in this deck, with the exception of Edric, have power or toughness equal to 1. They'll be able to get in unblocked with this card on the battlefield. And the cool thing about this too is it's actually a rogue, so it will help with your Notorious Throng. Next up, let's go over the ways that we're able to take extra turns in this deck. The extra turn spells that are the best in this deck are the ones that don't exile when you play them. So first up, we have Notorious Throng. It's 3 and a blue for a tribal sorcery rogue. and it has Prowl. You can pay 5 and a blue. You may play this for its Prowl cost if you dealt combat damage to a player this turn with a rogue. Put X 1/1 black fairy rogue creature tokens with flying into play, where X is the damage dealt to your opponents this turn. If Notorious Throng's Prowl cost was paid, take an extra turn after this one. This is the absolute best extra turn spell in our deck. Not only does this not exile when you play it, so you can keep getting this card back, which is the primary way of winning the game with this deck, you can get a bunch of fairy tokens with flying that you can put onto the battlefield with this card before you take that extra turn. And we do have quite a few rogues in our deck that are going to enable us to play this for its Prowl cost. And then if we have a way of returning this back from our graveyard to our hand or to the top of our library after we take that extra turn, we're going to be able to keep playing this and put a ton of fairies onto the battlefield, and then we'll be able to kill our opponents really quickly once we find this card. Next up, we have Walk the Eons. It's 4 blue for a sorcery that has buyback. You can sacrifice 3 islands, and if you do, you can put this card back into your hand as it resolves. And it says target player takes an extra turn after this one. This card does not exile when you play it, so this is another great one to get back with some of the cards that we have in our deck that enable us to take instance or sorcery cards and put them back into our hand. Next up, we have Karn's Temporal Sundering. It's 4 blue for a legendary sorcery. You can only cast this card if you control a legendary creature or a planeswalker. And target player takes an extra turn after this one. Return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and then you exile Karn's Temporal Sundering. Next up, we have Part the Waterveil. It's 4 blue for a sorcery. Take an extra turn after this one, and then exile Part the Waterveil. And you can also play this for its Awaken cost. It's Awaken 6 for 6 blue. You can play it for that cost, and then you can put 6 +1/+1 counters on target land you control, and it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with haste. It's still a land. Then we have Beacon of Tomorrows. It's 6 blue for a sorcery. Target player takes an extra turn after this one, and then shuffle Beacon of Tomorrows into its owner's library. This is another great one because it's a repeatable effect that you can keep putting into your library and then keep casting whenever you draw it. Temporal Trespass is 8 blue for a sorcery with Delve. Each card you exile from your graveyard while casting this spell pays for 1. Take an extra turn after this one and then exile Temporal Trespass. This is another great one that can get a lot cheaper with the cards that you have in your graveyard to cast this spell. Next up, let's go over a couple of cards that we put into this deck so that we're able to get back some of our instant or sorcery cards, especially our extra turn cards in this deck. So first up, we have Noxious Revival. It's a Phyrexian green for an instant. Phyrexian green can either be paid with green or 2 life. Put target card from a graveyard on top of its owner's library. And then Reclaim is a green for an instant. Put target card from your graveyard on top of your library. Both of these are really nice because they are instant, so you can do this at any time at the end of your opponent's turn to set up for your next turn or whenever you'd like. Regrowth is similar. It's 1 and a green for a sorcery. Return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Next up, we have Recollect. It's 2 and a green for a sorcery. Return target card from your graveyard to your hand. And then we have Archaeomancer. It's 2 blue for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. These are all really great ways of getting back those extra turn spells, but you can also get back some of your interaction if you need it as well. Next up, let's go over a couple of cards that we included in this deck that give us a little bit of extra utility and help us with our strategy. So first up, I'm going to go over 2 cards that help us draw cards and have a similar ability to Edric's ability. So if your Edric gets removed, you can still draw cards and find your extra turn spells or your interaction when you need it. So first up, we have Guardian Project. It's 3 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. And then Bident of Thassa is 2 blue for a legendary enchantment artifact. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. And then you can pay 1 and a blue, creatures your opponents control attack this turn if able. This gives you the same ability as Edric, so if something happens to your Edric, you still have another way of drawing cards. Next up, we have a card that's going to help us get some additional mana whenever our creatures attack. And it's Druid's Repository. It's 1 green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, put a charge counter on Druid's Repository, and then you can remove a counter and add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. If you have this on the battlefield and you go to attack with your creatures, you can get a bunch of mana off of this and then hopefully chain that into an extra turn spell so that you can attack again, and then the loop will just continue with this card. And then last but not least, we do have a couple of cards that are going to help us get some additional damage on our opponents. Since our strategy is to attack with a bunch of 1/1s or 2/2s, we do want a way of ending the game quickly quickly, and a couple of these cards will help us with that. So first up we have Beastmaster Ascension. It's 2 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, you may put a quest counter on Beastmaster Ascension. As long as Beastmaster Ascension has 7 or more quest counters on it, creatures you control get +5/+5. And then Throne of the God Pharaoh is 2 colorless for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. These are both going to deal a ton of damage to your opponents if they stick around on the battlefield and help you close out the game even faster. Next up, let's quickly go over the mana base that we include in this deck. So first up, we have Command Tower. It's a land that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. Exotic Orchard is a land that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. And then Yavimaya Coast taps to add a colorless to your mana pool, and then you can tap it to add a green or a blue to your mana pool. Yavimaya Coast deals 1 damage to you. These are all really great lands that enter the battlefield untapped that will produce mana in our commander's color identity. Next up, we have Mystic Sanctuary. It's a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other islands. And when it enters the battlefield untapped, you may put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. This is in here primarily to help you get back your extra turn spells that you have in this deck so you can replay them and keep getting in for damage. And then we have a couple of tap lands. We have Temple of Mystery, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it does, you can scry 1, and you can tap for a green or a blue. And then Simic Growth Chamber enters the battlefield tapped, and when it does, you have to return a land you control to its owner's hand, and you can tap to add a green and a blue to your mana pool. One thing to note with this card is if you do put it into the battlefield, make sure you tap your land for mana first so you can get some value off of it before you return it to your hand. And then we have 18 forests and 10 islands. Forests are much heavier in this deck because we do have a lot of early green drops in our deck. Next up, let's go over some of the upgrades that we can include in this deck that will make this deck a little bit more consistent and a little bit more powerful. So the first non-budget upgrade that I would include in this deck is Time Warp. It's 3 blue for a sorcery. Target player takes an extra turn after this one. The great thing about this card is it will go to your graveyard, so you can get this card back with all of your recursion in this deck. Next up, we have Temporal Manipulation, which has the exact same text on it as Time Warp, but just costs a little bit more money than Time Warp does. And this was just recently reprinted, so for a long time, this card was extremely expensive. It was only a Judge promo, and then it came out of a Portal set. So this was a tough card to get, and they reprinted it in Ultimate Masters, bringing the price down, which is great. The next card I put in this deck is another extra turn spell, and it's Temporal Mastery. It's 5 blue for a sorcery. Take an extra turn after this one, and then exile Temporal Mastery. You can pay this for its miracle cost of 1 and a blue. You may cast this card for its miracle cost when you draw it if it's the first card you drew this turn. Next up, we have Nexus of Fate. It's another extra turn spell. It's 5 blue for an instant. Take an extra turn after this one. If Nexus of Fate would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, reveal Nexus of Fate and shuffle it into its owner's library. We want to have the maximum amount of extra turn spells that we can in this deck, as they're going to really help us with our strategy of winning through combat damage. And Nexus of Fate was just in standard. It was really expensive, and it's really come down in price since then. It's only about $10, so I'd definitely pick it up if you don't have one already. Next up, there's a couple of cards that are going to help us find our extra turn spells, especially Notorious Strong, which is the best one in our deck. So first up, we have Mystical Tutor. It's 1 blue for an instant. Search your library for an instant or sorcery card and reveal that card. Shuffle your library, then put that card on top of it. This is a very cheap way of finding any instant or sorcery in our deck whenever we need it. And then the last upgrade that I put in this deck is Personal Tutor. It's 1 blue for a sorcery. Search your library for a sorcery card and reveal that card. Shuffle your library, then put that card on top of it. This is just like Mystical Tutor, except it's at sorcery speed, and it is a little bit more expensive because it only was in that Portal set and it hasn't been reprinted since, but it's still a really great card to help you find those extra turn spells in your deck. Thank you so much for watching this Budget Deck Tech today. If you have any suggestions for some of the picks in this deck, or agree with or disagree with some of the choices, let us know in the comments down below. If you like this video, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and check us out on Patreon over at patreon.com/BudgetEDH. There's a lot of different tiers for rewards over on Patreon. See you guys next time.